the Wagner revolt is still weighing heavily on the minds of Russians. This was evident after a palpably angry Russian President Vladimir Putin made an unplanned televised address to the Russian public in an attempt to project strength and unity after facing his biggest crisis since the full-scale invasion began last year of Ukraine. Even as a Russian mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin flew into exile in Belarus under a deal that ended the mutiny by his fighters, Belarusian President Lukashenko, in fact, who's seen as Putin's junior partner and Europe's last dictator, is positioning himself as the voice of reason. Revealing details of the deal with Prigozhin, Lukashenko also said that he talked the Wagner boss back from brink. And while those developments, in fact, continue to dominate headlines in Russia, the uprising has also highlighted and heightened anxieties in Beijing regarding Russia's war in Ukraine. Why do I say that? Now, China claims to maintain neutrality in the conflict, but has supported Russia in practice, blaming the United States of America and NATO for provoking the thwarted invasion of Ukraine. Now, despite this, doubts have emerged about whether China made the right decision in aligning closely with the Kremlin and Putin. And while we speak about the war, 8 people have been killed, including 3 children, by Russian missiles that hit the center of Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. A restaurant, a shopping area were all hit in Tuesday's strike on the city, which is currently under Ukrainian control but is very close to the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. Social media and drone footage from the scene, in fact, show significant damage to the buildings, some of which have been reduced to rubble. A rescue operation is currently underway in the city center, with security agencies assisting emergency services at the scene and also evacuating the victims. Local authorities also say that the area had a high concentration of civilians when the missiles hit.
A twisted web of metal beams and ash. The aftermath of an attack that snuffed out the lives of people eating dinner at a restaurant in Ukraine. Footage from the National Police appeared to show the city of Kramatorsk as it was confronted with yet another day of grief on Tuesday. Russian missiles hit the city again, killing at least 4, according to local officials and police. More than 40 were injured. The dead included a child. Speaking to Reuters, witnesses said they were in disbelief.
I ran here after the explosion because I rented a cafe here. Everything has been blown out there. There's nothing. No windows, no doors. All I see is destruction, fear, and horror. This is the 21st century.
And all the destruction is shocking to see in real life. When you see in photos, it's different. What you see on TV doesn't even begin to show what you see in real life.
The Donetsk Regional State Administration posted video of people dressed in military fatigues helping move the injured. As darkness fell on the city, people were still seen in police video being pulled from the rubble. Missiles also hit a village on the fringes of the city on Tuesday and a cluster of buildings in Kremenchuk, about 230 miles west in central Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly video message that Moscow must be held to account.
Every such act of terror proves again and again to us and the whole world that Russia deserves only one thing as a consequence of all that it has done: defeat and a tribunal, fair and lawful trials against all Russian murderers and terrorists.
Kramatorsk has frequently been a target of Russian attacks. It's a major city west of the front lines in Donetsk province and a likely key objective in any Russian advance. Russia denies targeting civilian sites in what it has described as a, quote, special military operation since invading its neighbor in February 2022.
Между тем хочу отметить, и хочу, чтобы тоже мы все знали об этом, содержание всей группы «Вагнер» полностью обеспечилось государством. Из Министерства обороны, из государственного бюджета мы полностью финансировали эту группу. Вот только с мая 22 года по май 23 на денежное содержание и стимулирующие выплаты государство заплатило компании «Вагнер» 86 миллиардов 262 миллиона рублей. При этом собственник компании «Конкорд» через военторг при всем том, что само содержание Вагнера было на плечах государства, за год собственник компании «Конкорд» через военторг получил, заработал от государства, поставляя продукты питания и оказывая услуги по питанию в армии, заработал 80 миллиардов рублей.
We all saw the events in Russia over the last days. These are internal Russian matters, but what is clear is that President Putin's illegal war against Ukraine has deepened divisions and created new tensions in Russia. At the same time, we must not underestimate Russia. So it's even more important that we continue to provide Ukraine with our support. I think it's too early to make any final conclusions on the long-term consequences, including for NATO. But what we can say is that we are, of course, closely monitoring the developments, and we have already increased our readiness, our preparedness, and our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. We will make further decisions to further strengthen our collective defense with more high readiness forces and with more capabilities to ensure credible deterrence and defense for the whole alliance.
In fact, let me cut across to my colleague Sanjay Suri, who is joining us on this live stream. Sanjay, first of all, there is too much that's happening in Russia, especially after the Wagner revolt. What really has come to light after that sudden address by the president of Russia? In fact, we are told that there is the line with Sanjay is not yet through. We'll try and re-establish that connection. But like we were discussing, ever since that Wagner rebellion, things are not very certain when it is about Russia. And even in the face of that, and that address that the Russian President Vladimir Putin really made to the nation, where he's speaking about how the rebellion was crushed before it could start, the Belarusian side is also trying to actually garner any sort of complicit measures when it is about thwarting the rebellion. While that is happening, Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian cities. Kramatorsk is the first example that we have after the Wagner rebellion, and that isn't stopping. The other aspect that's come to light as far as this entire episode is concerned is China's proximity with Russia. Earlier, China had on record maintained neutrality. However, in principle, it has always supported Russia in their war against Ukraine. But now, after this Wagner rebellion, the mutiny, they're also in two minds on whether the support that they're offering to Russia is something that they should in fact continue with. And those deliberations are happening in the high circles of China also. And while all of that is happening, and while this entire war between Russia and Ukraine continues to hit global headlines, the mutiny by the Wagner group was something that had become a certain cog in the wheel. Let me actually bring my colleague Sanjay, who's now with us on this live stream. Sanjay, we were talking about the Wagner rebellion. We will go about talking about the bombings in Kramatorsk in just a bit. But I'd like to understand, what is the China angle after this entire mutiny was crushed? And Belarus, of course, claims that it had everything to do with it. China having two minds about their support to Russia against the war in Ukraine. Why is that happening now?
Well, that could be a very significant moment, because there would have been a great deal of discussion in Beijing on its position, and Beijing is now risking losing connections and a degree of rapport, to the extent there was any, with much of the world, certainly with the US, certainly with Canada, Western Europe, and these are, let's not forget, huge markets for Chinese goods. If China were to alienate all of these, it could have a long-term consequence on its own economy, because the economies are inextricably intertwined. And there will be some thinking, what is China giving this up for or risking much of this for? Is it to back a Putin in a war that even the Chinese do not seem to think justified? We remember that 12-point plan that the Chinese had produced on February the 24th of this year on the anniversary. And one of the elements there was vaguely stated, but stated nevertheless, that China believes in the territorial integrity of nations and believes in the UN Charter. So already there were signs that the Chinese do want to stick to those principles. That was overtaken to some extent by some amount of politicking and maneuvering, where China decided to back Russia, speaking of a different kind of world order. But that kind of a dubious ideology is not going to stand in the face of its own interests, and Chinese could be beginning to recognize that now.
All right. Also, Sanjay, about this entire bombing of the Kramatorsk region of Ukraine that is still under Ukrainian control, but it's very, very close to the Russian territory also. I'd like to understand, despite all of that that is happening in Russia, the bombings on Ukrainian towns is not really stopping. What really is going on in Russian President Vladimir Putin's head, considering the kind of, sort of global lack and support that is happening against Russia is also weighing heavily on him, and also in the face of this rebellion by the Wagner group?
You know, this attack on Kramatorsk could well have been directed by the Defense Ministry, by the military command. And this has been a tragedy of Ukrainian cities that are close to the border, close to the front line. We saw that earlier in Kharkiv, it was destroyed. The tragedy of Kharkiv is where it is located is within shelling distance of the Russians. We see that down south in Kherson, just across the river, that's where the Russian military is and their artillery pieces are. And they've been shelling Kherson day in and day out. And I remember I was there not long back, and we were under shelling all the time. We could hear it all around us. And so Kramatorsk is a very short distance from Bakhmut. It is just well within a range of shelling and short distance rockets. And these will become very much more difficult to intercept than the ICBMs, which could be intercepted by Patriots and neutralized. And there has been a remarkable success in that so far with Ukraine. But this area and other areas that are within short range of artillery fire and rockets will always be very vulnerable, and the Russians think nothing of killing people in their homes. They've been doing it for a year and a half, coming to that, all over the country.
All right. Sanjay Suri, thank you so much for joining us. On that note, let me also bring in my guest who's joining us on this live stream. Ruslan Botnik, who's the director of Ukraine Institute of Politics, is with us. Mr. Botnik, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. First of all, everything that has happened in Russia over this last 1 week, how do you see that rebellion, and how do you see the response that's come in from the Russian president, Mr. Putin?
Mr. Putin is trying to show that he is gathering all the power in Russia, and he is the main in Russia, even taking account this rebellion and the problems inside of Russia which this rebellion made. And Putin trying to use this situation to rebuild the Russian political elites and military enforcement agencies commanders. I think in the nearest future, a lot of heads in Russian government, in enforcement agencies will be changed. Because the situation showed a deep weakening of Russian state, and even in this immunity. Also, Putin is trying to take back support from the passionate part of Russian society, because passionate part, imperial part of Russian society was behind the Prigozhin, supported Prigozhin, and nowadays Putin trying to take this support back from Prigozhin, starting the discreditation campaign against Prigozhin, and answering the society why this crisis happened.
Okay. Also, Mr. Botnik, I'd like to understand this other aspect, that despite this rebellion that Russia is facing, and of course, Belarus has everything to do with throttling it, at least for the time being. We'd like to understand the Russian offensive that isn't stopping against Ukraine. How do you see that move?
Of course, this rebellion makes some kind of disorder with supplying and managing the Russian military company in Ukraine. But maybe it's temporary disorder, and I think Russia is preparing for the long-term war and trying to defend captured lands in the face of Ukrainian counteroffensive operation.
Also, Mr. Botnik, lastly, even in the face of an alienation by the international community, Russia continues with its offensive. What has happened in Kramatorsk is very recent, an example with that. But while we speak about that, we also are given to understand that China is now in two minds about its support to Russia. Do you think the Wagner rebellion has everything to do that to Beijing?
We have to understand that Wagner Group is still important for Russia and for China also, because they do a very important work for them in Africa, in Mali, Niger, Central African Republic, and so on. So China will continue her balance between the Russia military group inside of Russia and different towers in the Kremlin and the Belarus. At the same time, Belarus is trying to reinforce their army using the Wagner resources and Wagner experience.